In October 2024, a Navy ship sank. Everyone got out alive, and then they charged the crew. This month, we've been pulling that story apart and asking whether the lessons the organizations say they're learning are actually the ones that matter. Welcome back to the On Target Leadership and Learning podcast. I'm Sam, here with Mike, and we are keeping this one short and sharp today. We're going for a bit of a month in review after a pretty jam-packed March 2026. So we're going to cover a bit of what we've been doing, what we've been reading, and what's coming. And we're going to ensure that you get some of those key takeaways out of those events of April of this year. So first and foremost, we had our Brisbane Under Pressure event. And this one, Mike, was pretty unique for us. It was the first time that we just opened up the doors and said, here's an enrollment link, get stuck in, and we didn't know who was going to turn up. So do you want to touch perhaps on the people in the room and their backgrounds?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so we had 5 safety professionals. 4 of them, or 3 of them, didn't know each other. The other 2 knew each other but didn't know the other 3. So a kind of completely disparate group of people. There were people from Brisbane, people from Western Australia, people who heralded from Sydney, all over the place. But they were all from different backgrounds, but had ended up in a relatively focused safety role within their organization. So that was pretty cool. Lots of different contexts, lots of different ideas, but coming together with a sort of real shared goal of seeing what they could take out of our class and take back into their own workspace. Fantastic couple of days. Really, really enjoyable. And we got some pretty good feedback from people who'd been doing this sort of thing from a very long time. You know, Pete said, I've been in this industry for 40 years, I think he said, 30 or 40 years. And that was the most engaging workshop he'd done so far. That was the end of day one anyway. So that was pretty good to get that sort of feedback from one of the class participants.
I thought it was really interesting, to your point, that we didn't target safety professionals. In fact, it was leadership under pressure most broadly. But coincidentally or otherwise, we ended up with 5 safety professionals in the room. And in a moment, I'm going to ask you one thing that surprised you, but I'm going to lead with one thing that surprised me. Once we saw the enrollments coming and we saw that it was all safety related people, part of me thought, great, because that's the origin story of what we teach. And the other part of me thought, bugger, are we just going to be preaching to the choir? And are they going to leave having not got much value? But as it turned out, that was far and away not the case. And I remember one of the participants, Taryn, who is a helicopter pilot, very well versed in what we talk about, left saying that it was excellent and she's about to move into a corporate role out of flying. And what she really took out of it was how much the stuff that she used to know and wouldn't have thought it applied to corporate leadership, how much of that applies and how she can apply it, which is obviously exactly what we're doing here. So that stood out for me. What about for you? Something that surprised you and stood out?
I think the remark that you've made about Taryn probably would have been the one I'd picked as well, because that really did stand out. And, you know, you and I talked about that quite a bit beforehand, you know, and during the breaks and certainly afterwards. So it was great to get that feedback from someone like Taryn with her background. But beyond that, I think it was probably how I was really quite struck and impressed with how Jordan, who came along with his sort of job within the Coca-Cola soft drinks industry and wanted to try and bring see what he could learn from what we were doing and bring that back into an organization that I just wouldn't even think of having an interest in the kind of thing that we're doing. So it really did. And he certainly got a lot of value out of the class as well, I think. And that really, really showed through to me just how much value there is in what we do and how much, you know, the diversity of potential people, teams, leaders that can get something out of an on-target workshop and the kind of things we're trying to get across, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, awesome. Totally. And the other thing with Jordan makes a good point, and not to pick on him, but you know, our listeners will know by now that we're so big on applying the theory and applying it in practice with someone watching to provide feedback. And I think Jordan's example, he was the last one and had arguably the most challenging leading the team practical exercise.
Yeah, I think so.
And he had the guide, the debrief guide right there with him. And once the spotlight was on, it was his turn to use it. He quite naturally fell into old habits and deviated from it. And it was after a couple of prompts of, you know, come back to the outcomes, start with the outcomes. And once he started following that, it gained much more momentum. And I think he would have left with a great tool that he thought was really useful and easy to follow. But had he not actually got into the seat and given it a go, then he wouldn't have got as much out of it had he not done that practical side.
Yeah, the practical side of it is key, definitely.
Mm-hmm. And then, so that was a 2-day workshop. And at the end of that, before I jump into the third question there, Mike, we then trundled on down to a local Brisbane pub, to their conference or their meeting area, and took part in the Brisbane Safety Differently book club. That was quite a novel experience. Josh and Stephen, who run it, make it a really welcoming and really relaxed affair for essentially safety professionals to get together. And typically, as the name would suggest, it's run with a guest author. Now, we don't have a book, but we were lucky enough to be in the hot seat there as it was. And again, some really positive feedback. And I say that because it links into my third question, Mike, which is, what do those 2 days tell you about the demand for the kind of work that we're doing at the moment?
I would like to say that there's probably more demand than people realize themselves. I had a good chat with a friend of mine, Ben, last night, and one of the things he talked about was how when people are recruited, they are recruited on their technical skills, their ability, their resume, which tends to be a list of technical achievements. However, when those people are let go, it's usually to do with their behaviors, lack of trust, lack of benevolence, lack of the way that they can empathize with people or work within teams or whatever. So we recruit on skills. Unrecruit, we sack people based on behaviors, which is quite an interesting way of putting it. I'd never really thought about it in quite those terms. But therefore, if we want to not have to sack people, maintain our workforce, improve our workforce once we've recruited them based on their technical skills, we need to do more on their behaviors, what you and I would call their non-technical skills. And that's certainly what On Target is really trying to focus on, try and give our clients something different, which is what I think our workshops really offer, to have an engaging experience where they can practice, develop, become aware of, and therefore improve their non-technical skills, their teamwork, their communication, their empathy, their culture, perhaps, such that they can actually grow their organizations without having to constantly hire and fire. Lots of demand.
Yeah, really, really interesting take. Alrighty, so that's the doing side that we got up to primarily, but a bit of deep thinking in the month as well. And so Mike puts out an excellent blog, if I do say so, every week. And you can subscribe to that through our LinkedIn page. This month, one got quite a bit of traction. Mike, do you want to give us set the scene briefly?
Yeah, sure. So most of the blogs that we cover tend to be focused on airplane crashes or digging into the reports that come out of airplane crashes, mainly because that's our background. But there's a few other good ones out there to do with other sort of serious events. And this was a good one. This was the sinking of the MNZS, or His Majesty's New Zealand ship Manawanui, which people will probably remember if I give them a bit more context, where it hit a reef off Samoa and sank a couple of years ago, October 2024, doing a relatively routine survey operation. Now, ship sank. Obviously, it's quite an expensive piece of hardware. That's quite a big deal. There's going to have to be some kind of investigation to dig into what happened and what we can fix. And like just about every other incident and accident that we dig into, there is no single dramatic failure. The situation most definitely evolves from lots of little things coming together to ultimately result in the accident where the ship hits the reef and ends up sinking. Nobody died, which was great. However, 3 members of the crew, and while it's not explicitly been said who that is, it's almost certainly the ship's captain and several other officers on the bridge, have now been the subject of a court-martial. And you kind of think to yourself, right, well, I've got to be honest, I don't really think that's fair, ultimately. Now, there's a couple of other things that came from the incident report, which the blog talks about. One of the one of the most useful words, which isn't necessarily thrown around that often, is hollowness. And in the context of what the report found or what the investigation found, was that the organization, the ship, the Navy, the wider support structure was stretched, whether it be through people, financial resources, the overloading of tasks, whatever. But the system was definitely stretched. That word hollowness comes up quite a few times in the report. And when systems get stretched in terms of resources, they will naturally rely on the people within those systems to try and plug the gaps. That's pretty common. That's relatively normal. And most militaries are staffed with people who have a can-do attitude and will want to try and bridge those gaps to enable the system to succeed. But there are limits, and it would appear that perhaps the sinking of the Manawanui did show that perhaps that hollowness had just gone a bit too far. So hollowness, that was one of the key themes from the report that we talked about in the blog. Another one was counterfactuals, which is a real pet hate of ours, as I'm sure you know, Sam. That the report says in quite a few times, crew should have done this. They failed to do the other. And the point is, it doesn't really matter, because when you use counterfactuals, i.e. saying something should have happened or you would have done something differently, they failed to do X when they should have done Y. Well, it doesn't really matter because you're telling a story that didn't happen, and that doesn't really help learning. So in context, there is a comment which stood out from the report where it says the crew should not have been distracted. Brilliant. Doesn't help. Ultimately, they were distracted because of whatever reason. So that's where we actually have to dig into what distracted them. Was it appropriate? How can we make them improve in future such that they don't get distracted? That's where we really want to get some learning, because as soon as you have those counterfactual comments, it's just blame dressed up as instant analysis. Doesn't help.
And if I can jump on that, sorry, the counterfactuals, it's an easy trap to fall into, and I think we've all done it, but that one should not have been distracted. Are you bloody kidding me? That really got my blood boiling, as you could probably hear.
Yeah.
I can't believe that. And I want to, almost like find the person who wrote that, sit them down in a car and sit next to them with a full balloon and a pin and just put it next to them and, blow the balloon at some point and then say, oh, you shouldn't have been distracted. Like, what, mate? Look, I could go on. That one really gets me, and it's just so utterly useless. Like, it's like you said, it's blame dressed up as analysis.
No, that's all right. Let's not talk about root cause analysis. That's a whole other story. All
Moving
right.
on.
So the other thing that I wanted to get into with the blog, looking at the report from the sinking, that the report identified quite accurately, I would suggest, that the oversight system supporting the ship and its infrastructure and its crew and everything else, that didn't catch the problems either. And there's a few anecdotal bits of stuff that I've got from other sources that suggest that a lot of these problems have been around for a while, but they were just kind of ignored, tolerated, accepted, whatever you want to call it. But ultimately they existed and were there and not dealt with until the sinking happened, or after the sinking happened. So you've got this acknowledgement that the wider system of oversight and support and bigger leadership beyond the actual ship's crew didn't catch these problems either, even though it acknowledged that they existed. So therefore, my real bugbear is, why are the only people in court-martial these senior members of the ship's crew, despite the fact you've got all these problems identified? I think it's a real shame. And I hope that something comes out of it for the positive. I'm not sure that it will, now that it's gone down this court-martial route. I think that's a real.
Totally. Yeah. And so I think those 3 points tied together, hollowness, which, the gap between almost supply and demand, right?
Mm-hmm.
Between the capacity that's available and the capacity that's demanded. The counterfactuals shouldn't have been distracted. It's like, okay, sure, in a perfect world, no, but they were. So let's work out why. What were the conditions that led to them being distracted, and remove those, because they're bloody humans. Yep. I'll stop myself. And as you say, the oversight system didn't catch it, but anyway, we're still going to court-martial the last 3 people to touch it. What does all of that do, or that report coming out and hanging those 3 people, proverbially, what does that do to culture? And someone commented on the blog post and alluded to that.
Yeah, the phrase fear of failure came up from one of the people that commented on it on LinkedIn, which is pretty cool, actually, because it's a thread that I hadn't necessarily explicitly pulled on during the blog or really thought that much about. And it's a really good one to dig into, and it's perhaps a tangent as to what this chap Carl Seymour was talking about. But as soon as you start to play the blame game and you kind of acknowledge that these systemic faults exist, but you're going to send somebody to court-martial anyway, it just doesn't really matter, because it's just got so much potential of driving things underground, and people won't want to admit to the little things for fear of getting punished. And then all of a sudden these little things mount up again and again and again, and in another, I don't know, 5, 10, 20 years, we'll have another sinking and we'll be doing exactly the same thing again. So I think there's a few cultural issues at stake here that Carl Seymour brought out in one of the comments to do with fear of failure. And I think it's a really interesting subject to dig into.
Totally. And I think from the safety perspective, it's evidently not obvious is not the right word to use. But the next 3 people on the bridge, may well, in that example, pause and think, do I really want to report the near miss that I had? Because look what happened to those 3. But then if we take it to a slightly more, shall we say, positive business perspective, my other work is in a technology startup, and fear of failure is crushing for a startup, right? So we're very deliberate in the culture that we set there in giving people and actively encouraging them to try things and fail and share the lessons that come out of them, because otherwise you don't iterate effectively. And if you don't iterate, you don't keep up, and then you don't exist.
Yeah, makes complete sense.
A different perspective. Okay, so in keeping with our month in review podcast today, We're going to announce something called the Black Box. We've been getting a lot of questions. How can I stay across this kind of content without hunting for it? And we do very deliberately try and put a lot of useful content out there. So we are launching the Black Box. I think it was an awesome name and really gets to the heart of what we're doing. And it's a retrospective analysis on the month that's just occurred. Cases we've covered, the themes that have come out of them, workshops we've done. And it's not just to tell you what we've done, but really it's so that we can share the learnings that came out of that, including our own. So short, sharp, evidence-based newsletter format, straight to your inbox. If you would like to get involved and have that arriving in your inbox once a month, you can go to ontargetteaming, all one word, .com/subscribe and throw your details there and it will appear in your inbox every month. I like to think of that one as the debrief after the debrief. Okay, looking forward. Mike, do you want to touch on what's coming up next?
Yeah, sure. So
next Friday.
Just under a week's time. So next Friday afternoon, about 12:30, I think it is, Australia East Coast time. We're going to be taking part 12 p.m. There we go. Yep. Otherwise, I won't be half an hour late. Thanks for that reminder. We're going to be appearing on the Myosh Academy, which is a leading safety platform. And what their academy does is they produce a series of online live sessions recording that are recorded. And they bring together practitioners and thinkers in the safety space, which is where we come in. So they've invited us to participate, which can be pretty cool. And the idea is we'll be talking for, I think, anywhere between half an hour and an hour, depending on how carried away we get and how many questions come in. But our intent is to focus on what we would probably describe as the art of the debrief. It's where we think we've got really something a bit different to offer to a lot of safety professional courses or workshops or products. And we're really going to try and talk about and hopefully get some discussion going about the art of the debrief. It's not easy. We talked about Jordan doing the workshop a couple of weeks ago and how you can't just read a book or look at a PowerPoint slide and expect to nail the debrief. We're going to give people some real life, hopefully practical tips to make their debriefing more effective. That's where we're going to focus on next Friday.
Awesome. Yeah. And look, it is targeted at safety professionals and WHS, HSEQ leaders, but really anyone who's interested can get along. And it's a short format. And part of the reason we're focusing on briefing and debriefing, not only because we are so passionate about it, but because it's one where we can give you some really, really short, tangible, easily implementable tools to take away tomorrow. And one that's resonated in the past, as a little sneak peek now, is that your debrief doesn't need to be War and Peace. And Mike and I tell a lot of people recently, you can just say, what surprised you out of that? Was it out of that project, out of that shift or whatever? And if you ask that question and listen to the answer, you'll often get some pretty good learning coming out of that.
And all of a sudden, the debrief does turn into War and Peace.
Yeah, certainly. Awesome. Okay, mate. Well, yeah, a little bit different to our typical podcast, but we just figured a little bit to talk about over the last month, especially this really pleasing and intriguing resonance that is happening with the safety world and how a lot of that, again, as we say, translates directly to the corporate leadership world. Jump on the blog, have a read of the Manawanui article, head over to ontargetteaming.com/subscribe and jump into our monthly Black Box newsletter. And hopefully you can join us next Friday, 12 p.m. AST for the Myosh Academy. And we'll throw links to all of the above into the show notes, etc. Mike, anything to add before we wrap it up?
Thanks for a good little chat, Sam. Really enjoyed that.
Awesome. Thanks, mate. And to all the listeners, go out and ask a colleague what surprised them work-wise this week and see what comes of it. Thanks, everyone.